play anything with a mouthpiece: trumpet, trombone, euphonium, even saxophone. By the time he was a teenager, James Morrison wasn't just a prodigy, he was a phenomenon. Dizzy Gillespie praised him, Ray Charles invited him on stage, and jazz legends saw in him the future of their genre. But then, something changed. Why did the jazz world, the very world that once embraced him as a golden child, suddenly fall silent when his name was mentioned? Why did critics, colleagues, and purists begin to look the other way? This is not just a story about a gifted musician. It's about the cold silence that followed the standing ovations, the whispers behind closed doors, the invitations that stopped coming. James Morrison, once the darling of international jazz, found himself isolated, not by the public, but by his own peers. Some say he betrayed the essence of jazz by making it too accessible, too commercial. Others hint at rivalries, at deep-seated jealousy from a community uncomfortable with a genius who wouldn't play by their unspoken rules. Whatever the reason, Morrison's fall from grace wasn't a tabloid scandal. It was subtler, more cruel. It was being excluded without ever being openly condemned. Before long, James Morrison began disappearing from major jazz circuits, turning instead to teaching, composing, and quietly nurturing new talent. But behind his ever-present smile and unshakable optimism, was there a man who had been deeply wounded? Tonight, we uncover the silent rebellion against a musical genius. A story not many dared to tell, until now. To understand the rise and quiet rejection of James Morrison, we must first return to the cultural landscape of Australia in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It was a time of creative expansion, but also one of rigid musical hierarchies. Jazz, especially, was sacred ground. Guarded by purists, performed in smoky clubs, it was a genre steeped in tradition and suspicion toward change. Amid this scene, a boy from Borowa, New South Wales, began drawing attention not just for his extraordinary technique, but for the sheer volume of instruments he could command. At age 7, Morrison picked up his first trumpet. By 13, he was playing professionally. By 16, he was already considered one of Australia's most promising jazz musicians. And by 21, he was sharing stages with international giants, Dizzy Gillespie, B.B. King, Ray Charles, and Wynton Marsalis. His debut at the Monterey Jazz Festival shocked even the most hardened critics. Morrison didn't just play jazz. He breathed it, reshaped it, made it bend to his own language. But in doing so, he also drew the ire of those who believed jazz should remain untouched, complex, inaccessible, even elitist. While the public adored him, the jazz establishment, especially in Australia and parts of Europe, began to mutter. They whispered that his music was too clean, too entertaining, even too cheerful. What they couldn't articulate was their discomfort with a man who refused to conform. Morrison was not the tortured artist. He smiled too much. He didn't drink, didn't suffer publicly, didn't moan about the purity of music. Instead, he dazzled, improvised, and elevated jazz with a sense of playfulness that unsettled the rigid keepers of tradition. And then came the most subtle fracture. Invitations to festivals slowed down. Collaborations became sparse. His name, once spoken in the same breath as Marsalis or Metheny, began to disappear from critical discourse. But there was no scandal, no dramatic fall, just silence. In those years, Morrison withdrew into education. He founded the James Morrison Academy of Music. He gave lectures, mentored thousands, and quietly composed. He never attacked his critics, never defended himself publicly. Yet the wound of exclusion of being quietly pushed aside ran deeper than most ever knew. The story we're about to unfold is not just about James Morrison's music, but about a quiet war within the jazz world, about what happens when brilliance threatens tradition, and about a man who dared to shine too brightly in a genre that sometimes prefers its stars to burn slow. James Morrison's journey began in the quiet town of Borowa, where music wasn't a luxury, it was a calling. He was born into a musical family, with a brother who played drums and a mother who encouraged curiosity over conformity. By the time most children were learning to ride bikes, Morrison was mastering entire families of brass instruments. Trumpet, trombone, flugelhorn, euphonium. He could play them all and switch between them mid-performance without missing a beat. At just 13, he was already performing in Sydney nightclubs, often the youngest and most talented musician in the room. His reputation spread like wildfire. He enrolled in the New South Wales Conservatorium of Music, But it quickly became clear that formal education couldn't keep pace with his gift. By 16, he had outgrown the institution. He wanted stages, not classrooms. Then came the international breakthrough. In 1987, Morrison performed at the Monterey Jazz Festival, one of the most prestigious stages in the world. He stunned audiences and veterans alike. He played not just with skill, but with an electric joy that defied the genre's typical stoicism. Jazz wasn't just alive in Morrison's hands. It was playful, expansive, and infectious. Soon after, he toured with legends: Ray Charles, B.B. King, George Benson, Quincy Jones. He became the youngest guest soloist ever invited to perform with the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. He was, to many, the embodiment of what jazz could become. But as his international acclaim grew, so did the unease back home. In Australia, the jazz scene was small but deeply rooted in tradition. It leaned heavily on bebop, swing, and the classics. Morrison, with his clean-cut image, crossover appeal, and commercial success, was becoming something else entirely: a jazz entertainer. He composed TV themes, recorded with symphony orchestras, and even dabbled in pop-inflected arrangements. For jazz purists, this wasn't evolution. It was betrayal. Whispers began. Critics complained that Morrison lacked authenticity. Some accused him of diluting jazz for mass appeal. Others took aim at his technique, claiming he played too perfectly, that he made it look easy, that he lacked the soul-wrenching anguish they associated with true jazz. It didn't matter that these critiques were often vague or contradictory. They created a narrative. And in the insular world of Australian jazz, narratives become walls. Then came the rift. Around the late 1990s, Morrison found himself increasingly distanced from the jazz festival circuit. He was still performing globally, still recording, but invitations from major Australian jazz events became noticeably absent. Interviews grew rare. He was no longer the poster boy of a genre he once helped bring to national attention. Rather than fight back, Morrison pivoted. He focused on education, establishing his own academy to train young jazz musicians in Mount Gambier. He poured his energy into mentoring, into shaping the next generation, perhaps hoping they wouldn't suffer the same fate. But even there, his methods raised eyebrows. He promoted a broader, more inclusive approach to jazz. He encouraged musicians to innovate, to blend genres, to reach audiences, not just impress other musicians. And again, the gatekeepers watched in disapproval. Yet through it all, Morrison never publicly lashed out. He never named names, never fed the controversy. But those close to him speak of moments of frustration, of sadness, even hurt. He had given his life to jazz. Why had jazz turned its back on him? The rise of James Morrison was dazzling, fast, and almost mythic. But beneath that meteoric ascent was the slow burn of rejection, not from audiences or the public, but from the very world he belonged to, a world that saw him not as a savior, but as a threat. For years, the silence surrounding James Morrison wasn't spoken of, not in interviews, not in magazines, and certainly not on stage. There was no official blacklisting, no open feud, just a quiet turning away. And in jazz, that silence says everything. It began with the critics. Subtle shifts in tone. Reviews that once praised his innovation now focused on what they called showmanship. Words like flashy, superficial, and overpolished crept into articles. His technical brilliance, once admired, became ammunition. One journalist wrote, "It's almost too easy for him. Jazz should have struggle, not spectacle." Within the community, the whispers grew louder. Morrison's decision to collaborate with pop musicians, to write commercial themes for television, and to participate in highly produced concerts alienated him from a purist crowd that saw jazz as sacred and unchanging. He had built bridges to new audiences, but in doing so, burned bridges with old guardians. Then came the education wars. When Morrison launched the James Morrison Academy of Music, it should have been a triumph, a world-class musician giving back to young talent. But some in academia dismissed his efforts. Not rigorous enough, they claimed, too modern. His emphasis on creativity and accessibility over theory and history clashed with traditionalists who believed jazz could only be learned the hard way. At one conference, a fellow educator was overheard saying, "He's turning jazz into entertainment, not education." Morrison never responded. He smiled, taught his students, and kept playing. But behind the scenes, the toll was mounting. Close friends noted that Morrison grew more private. he began turning down interviews. He no longer attended certain festivals, even when invited. In an industry built on collaboration, he became a soloist, in every sense of the word. The darkest moment came when he was conspicuously left out of a major Australian jazz celebration. It wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate. Younger musicians, many of whom had been inspired by Morrison, were shocked, but the message was clear. He was no longer part of the circle. And still, he played. He composed, mentored, and even led orchestras. But the haunting truth lingered. His greatest wound wasn't the criticism. It was the betrayal of a community he had once lifted onto the world stage. He had made jazz accessible to Australians. He had put it on primetime. But instead of thanks, he received exile. One student, now a respected musician, said in an interview, "He made me believe that jazz wasn't about rules, it was about heart. But it's sad he had to pay for that belief." The media never fully explored this chapter. To most, Morrison remained the smiling maestro, the charming trumpet virtuoso. But beneath that surface was a man who had weathered a storm far more personal than most knew. Not a scandal, not a breakdown, just the slow erasure by those who couldn't control him. The public never turned their back on James Morrison. But the jazz elite, the very world he loved, did. And in their silence, they wrote a rejection more painful than any headline. At Aussie Uncovered, we don't just tell stories. We confront the uncomfortable truths hidden beneath polished legacies. And James Morrison's story is one of the most quietly tragic and yet defiantly inspiring tales we've encountered. Let's be clear, James Morrison is not just a great musician, he is a musical polymath. His ability to master multiple instruments with virtuosic precision is almost unmatched in modern jazz history. He could have comfortably stayed within the elite circuits of international jazz, played by the rules, and reaped the full benefits of critical adoration. But he didn't. He chose something riskier. He chose to make jazz inclusive, and for that, he paid a price. The fact that Morrison was shunned, subtly, systemically, and silently by parts of the Australian jazz establishment reveals more about the gatekeepers than it does about him. Their discomfort wasn't with his talent, but with his independence, his refusal to fit into the tortured genius mold, his insistence on smiling, on reaching wider audiences, on mentoring, on joy. Was he too commercial? Perhaps. Was he too visible in mainstream media? Probably. But is that a crime against jazz? Or was that jazz finally evolving, finally speaking to the everyday Australian who never set foot in a smoky jazz club? We believe Morrison didn't betray jazz. He disrupted it. He made it accessible without dumbing it down. He stood for innovation in a world that feared change. And when he was met with silence, he responded with education, with music, with generosity. There's something deeply unfair in how his contributions were brushed aside by purists who couldn't reconcile brilliance with popularity. But Morrison never asked for approval. He built his own world, with his own academy, his own orchestra, and his own philosophy. And that, in our eyes, is a legacy far more powerful than applause from any elite circle. His students adore him, his audiences love him. And those who really understand jazz know you don't exile a man like James Morrison. You study him, you celebrate him, and you listen. But now we want to hear from you. Did you know about Morrison's quiet exclusion? Do you think the jazz world was unfair? Or do you believe some boundaries in art should remain untouched? Let us know what you think. Because stories like these aren't just about music, they're about the cost of authenticity. He never raised his voice. He never slammed a door. He never called out those who slowly erased him from the stages he once lit up. James Morrison simply kept playing, one note at a time, as if music itself were his quiet rebellion. And maybe that's what makes his story so haunting. There was no dramatic fall from grace, no headlines, no disgrace. Just a slow, steady withdrawal, a silence louder than any scandal. The kind of silence that only someone deeply beloved can hear as betrayal. But Morrison chose not to fight it. He chose legacy over noise. Today, across Australia, in small towns and music schools, young musicians pick up their first trumpet or saxophone, and they do it because of him. They've watched him on stage, seen the joy in his eyes, and felt that maybe, just maybe, they too could belong in this world called jazz. And that may be the most powerful statement of all. He didn't need to be accepted by the gatekeepers to leave a mark that endures. His sound lives on in recordings, yes, but more importantly, in the confidence he gave to a generation who no longer feared being too different for jazz. Some say Morrison faded, but those who listen closely know he didn't fade. He transcended. Not every story ends with redemption in the spotlight. Some end in quieter places, in classrooms, in practice studios, in the hands of a teenager learning to improvise for the first time. That's where James Morrison truly lives now. Some stories are never told, but now you know. And perhaps the next time you hear a trumpet cry out in the night, not with sorrow, but with defiance, you'll remember the man who smiled his way through silence and made music anyway.